All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me today. My name is Troy Beattie, and I'm currently a senior at Queens College, pursuing a film studies major and business minor. To help give you a perspective on the topic of homelessness care in New York City today. For those who have been who are from the Big Apple, who have been in the Big Apple before, you can concede that when walking, one is more than likely to cross the path of a homeless individual. Uh, this problem has since been exacerbated by COVID-19, its lockdowns and lasting effects that we see today. With this in mind, I believe that in spite of the myriad of obstacles in addressing homeless care due to COVID-19, the COVID-19 pandemic, I believe that they can and must change the way that the city goes about maintaining its homeless population's care and the directions of its funding. So to help illustrate why the city should rethink their approach to homelessness care and its spending, I will be taking you through the following topics: homelessness in general, the shelter system within New York City, the general condition of shelters in New York City, and how public outreach deals with homelessness in comparison to the shelter system. So, as of January this year, January 2022, New York City's homeless population has reached 91,271 individuals. And of that, young adults, just like us, who are experiencing homelessness is currently 3,072 individuals. Such a high prevalence of homelessness in the city. What solution is the city providing them? So currently, uh, the city provides homeless individuals, or individuals close to homelessness, close to homelessness, temporary monetary assistance, so that they do not lose their home. One can opt into the city's FHEPS program, which is directed at families specifically, and the SODA, which is a one-time rental assistance program. The second option is shelter through 5 of its municipal shelter systems. And the last is not really said, but if you're not willing to do the others, it's really only the street. And of these, I want to educate you on the shelter system, as it's the option that needs the most work to ensure the quality of life for homeless individuals and New York City as a whole going forward. Come on. So there are 5 shelter systems within New York, and they are ran by 4 different agencies. The spread of them across the boroughs would be 93 in Brooklyn, 80 in Manhattan, 26 shelters in Queens, 87 shelters in the Bronx, and 1 in Staten Island. Across these shelters, the city has confirmed that about 45,000 of the 91,271 homeless individuals are being serviced by these shelters. This is slightly half than the total homeless population that we see today. And it brings into question, if there is so many shelters across the city, why are individuals seeking out their care? Which is why we've come to the shelter conditions. To answer that last question, or why individuals aren't using the shelter system, I looked at interviews and testimonials with people who have experience living within them. And from that, I've sourced from Hurdle, a U.S. Veteran, in his words. All I can say is that I fear the unknown, or what might be waiting for me at a shelter was worse than my fear of the known risk of staying on the street. That was where I was comfortable, and I think we're creatures of habit. We're comfortable in the most uncomfortable positions, and that just becomes home. From another 50-year-old U.S. Veteran, I used to leave here after bed check and go sleep on the A train going to Far Rockaway. You can't really sleep here. It isn't safe. And lastly, from a mother of 3, you don't get to sleep. You don't. You have to keep a watch over your shoulder for 24 hours. If you are not with your stuff every day, it's gone. Some people lock up their bedding until they come back to make sure it's still there. So these testimonies highlight that within New York City's shelter system, there is a deficit in both the maintenance of the shelter and the safety of individuals within New York City's municipal shelter systems. Individuals experiencing homelessness already have enough tribulations to deal with that it becomes understandable that they wouldn't want to risk the safety of their belongings, those with them, or themselves to go into the shelters. But why have the conditions of these shelters been able to deteriorate continually? I mean, we do have the funding, right? So let's go to shelter corruption with that, because that's kind of where the money's going, or it is. To illustrate why the money's not seen, I'd like to look at two managers within the shelter system, Victor Rivera on the top and Matthew Okebiyi. Sorry, I can't really pronounce his name. Okebiyi on the bottom right. In January 22, wait, let me start with Victor. He was the founder of the Bronx Parent Housing Network, the shelter system that oversees the Bronx mostly primarily now. And he was charged with bribery on the account of accepting kickbacks from contractors working within the organization and laundering the money through the entities he controlled. So firstly, just flat out corruption within the Bronx system, not good. And then this continued in January 2022, when it was brought to attention that Matthew Okebiyi, the founder of the African Americans Planning Commission, was hiring family members out of nepotism and putting them into higher roles. But despite this coming out and him financing his brother to the tune of $240,000, Matthew Okebiyi, his only real punishment as of this point was stepping down and transferring his role to the same brother that he gave $240,000 to. Now, with him as the what's it called, the head of this organization, they just collected $24 billion, and a portion of it was wired to Matthew Okebiyi. Great. So, with how the corrupt the management of homeless outreach, homeless shelter system is at the moment, I'd like to offer an alternative, which is community-driven outreach programs. Within the city, there are a myriad of these homeless outreach programs. Focus on are the Coalition for the Homeless, seen on the top, and the Bowery Mission, which is what was right there. So what do they actually do? How can they help the homeless population better than the government? Well, the goal of street outreach is to make connections to stable housing with tailored services and supports of the individual's choice, such as health, behavior, healthcare, transportation, access to benefits, and much more. Street outreach efforts accept that some individuals will not initially accept the offers of these outreach services or shelters, but they maintain a focus on creating connections to permanent housing outreach workers and reducing harm by producing critical life-saving resources such as food, water, clothing, blankets, and other necessities. The Coalition for the Homeless specifically hands out free meal kits and warm meals around the city. Crisis services such as eviction prevention and crisis intervention, one-on-one with these individuals trying to maintain their paperwork and residency. Housing programs, if a person is already homeless, they have their own system of residencies that they can put individuals into that is much cleaner than New York City shelters. And the last thing that I really, this program I'm a very big supporter of is job training, where they support the individual's rent while also giving them a skill so that once they are out of the shelter / homeless system, they're able to contribute to a community and really have a place to be. And then second group is the Bowery Mission. Like the coalition, they also give out meal services and have housing programs, but they also do a myriad of clothing drives and clothing give outs that are very important during the winter months because the city gets extremely cold. So now we can, now that we understand what a great what great things can be facilitated by public outreach. Let's see how is the city. I don't know if you can see the rest of that graph. How has the city dealt with it, or how does the city help public outreach in comparison to the municipal shelter system? Well, the first primary, I want to look at participatory budgeting first, because that sees a lot of works that are done for the homeless community, which it's a voting fund. It's a democratic funding system where individuals in the community can vote on something to build, whether it be a building or infrastructure. But it needs to be, one, voted on by the public, and two, at least cost more at least cost $50,000, and three, have a life or usable life of at least 5 years or more. And with that, spending is given to homeless, not communities, but the building of shelters and the services. But what's more focused on is the homeless budget, which I'll show you guys over here. Hopefully you can see my mouse. This was last year, 2022, 2021, and here we are this year, 2022. Currently, the funding has decreased from 2.8 billion last year to 2.15 billion this year, saying that due to COVID being over and not needing to use such emergency services, they needed what's it called? They don't need to invest as much, but I find this to be far from the truth. As seen, I think the city needs more funding on its homeless shelters due to the conditions seen both in the shelters and the corruption seen up top. But they need a better way of putting their money to use. I come to conclude that we should invest in community outreach programs rather than privatized agencies that have proved time and time again that they are only in this help for the monetary benefit rather than the benefit of their communities and the individuals around them. And I don't want to leave you on such a sad note that I don't want to end this presentation without providing a solution for those of us in the audience who aren't government members, who don't have government officials, who don't have the sway to make the changes that I and hopefully all of you after this presentation want to see. What can we do on a personal or community scale? The first thing is donate. You can always donate to outreach programs. They always need it, as the funding showed that it's going more towards the municipal. You can always, number two, volunteer. I've volunteered a myriad of times before. They don't really care what your work experience is. You could be used to either hand out food, or if you have the paperwork skills, you can help file tax work or what's the word? Identification forms for individuals. And lastly, you can advocate. You may not, as I said, you may not be a government official, but you certainly can write to one, asking for them to make the change that you want to see. But when writing to them, please be respectful and coherent. And with that, thank you so much for your time.
Great, thank you very much, Troy. I'm going to reclaim host.
Go for it. I think I might have to stop sharing. Good.
Thank you very much, Troy. Again, we're going to save questions for the end, at the end of our presenters, but that was very thought-provoking. I think some of the things that you have to say, so I'm sure we'll have questions. Okay, we're going to move to our second speaker, which is Kat Ray, and the title of the presentation is Cracks in the Foundation, the Past, Present, and Future of Disability Charity. So Kat, take it away. Do you need to be made host as well?
Let me see if I can share my screen. Can you all hear me well? Yeah, I can't share my screen. Okay. If I lean more close to the laptop, is this better? Okay. Yeah, I think I need to be granted permission to share.
So give me 1 second and I will make
Yep.
it first. And then I will mute myself.
Okay, I
You are
got
now.
it. Yep. Okay, can you all see this well? I think it's loading. Okay, so good morning, everyone. My name is Kat Ray, and I am a student at Macaulay Honors College at Hunter. So my project is called Cracks in the Foundation, the Past, Present, and Future of Disability Charities. For the past century, the American Disability Charity has ignored the voice of the community, which they are supposed to be helping, the disabled community, and much of their communications, as well as the work itself, has only reinforced both existing systems of power and also reinforced the public's stereotypes about disabled populations. In my project, I summarize these problematic trends and evaluate whether or not these trends have continued into the present disability charity with a case study of Autism Speaks, and then I will be concluding with recommendations. So let's get right into it. Disability charities have demonstrated 3 fundamental issues in their work, which are communications which reinforce pre-existing ableist biases, they have demonstrable ties to corporate interests rather than public good, and an insistence upon depoliticizing disability as well as depoliticizing social welfare. So first, we're going to be looking at these problematic communications. These charities reinforce ableist stereotypes through 3 different common narratives, the first of which is the overcoming narrative, and then cure narratives and tragedy narratives. So overcoming narratives drew upon this concept that the biggest obstacle disabled people face is their own disability. And the only way a disabled person can live a satisfying life is if they're freed from this disability and kind of abandon this part of their identity, or along with the next trend, they're cured from it. So the cure narrative sets the elimination of disability as the public's mission above anything else. And then concluding with the tragedy narrative, emphasize that disability is always a personal tragedy for a disabled person, their family, and the entire community, and the disabled child or adult is doomed to a life of eternal misery. So we can find really great examples of these overcoming trends as well as cure narrative in these 2 historical posters. The left is a 1964 poster from United Cerebral Palsy. So we see a young boy who is wearing braces and he's approaching the camera. And to the right of him reads the text. I'll read it aloud because I know it's kind of small. Look at me, I'm walking, and in smaller text, just a few faltering steps and yet the biggest thrill of his life. What comes next? Will he run and play like other youngsters? Although science has not yet found the final answer to cerebral palsy, there is much that can be done for the thousands of children who are now afflicted. So what is it worth for you to see even one little boy walk? If he lived next door, would you help? So again, it's really emphasizing that walking with braces or being in a wheelchair is not a quality of life, not a real quality of life for a person to live, which goes against a lot of the foundational opinions of the disabled community. So the right is the 1946 poster from the March of Dimes campaign. The poster shows in the left corner a young boy who's holding onto a rail, and there are footprints that lead to the right corner of the poster where the same boy is walking. The text in the right corner reads, "Your dimes did this for me," and then join the March of Dimes January 14th, 31st. So the March of Dimes Foundation's goal was to fund research on polio. So this graphic from the Muscular Dystrophy Association does a really good job at showing the tragedy narrative that was used in a lot of historical charities, and we're going to see if that's continued today. So it depicts at the top an image of comedian Jerry Lewis, and he's wearing a suit and his arm is around a child in a wheelchair. He's looking very somberly at the ground, and the child is facing straight, parallel to the camera. So in the text in the large white font that reads, "Wish I could tell him now," and then I'll read the smaller text, which says that his body will grow strong and straight, that someday he'll walk as others do, that he'll live out his normal years, but it will take much more than wishing to free him from the scourge of muscular dystrophy, the progressive muscle wasting disease from which he suffers. Like tens of thousands of similarly afflicted children, his only hope for liberation lies in scientific research. You can make that hope grow by contributing to the March Against Muscular Dystrophy. So among these posters that I've shown you, we can notice that there's an absence of disabled adults or teenagers. So this is a really common issue in this historical disabled charity. Despite that many of the clientele of these charities were disabled adults, these were never portrayed. So this reinforces ableist opinion that not only the disability is an inherent negative, but also the only acceptable place for a disabled person is in this role of being a child. So moving on to this next trend is the ties to corporate interests of charities. So they were frequently linked to campaigns by large corporations, which served to maintain a positive public image of different private companies. So they frequently depicted corporate executives as supreme moral leaders, and in the words of historian Paul Longmore, they reinforced the legitimacy of existing systems of status and power, all under the cloak of moral respectability. So this is a good example which comes from the snowmobile campaign in the 1970s, which is when snowmobiles became really popular, but they drew a lot of criticism for being really noisy and for polluting the environment. So simultaneous with their political lobbying, they started a campaign with the Easter Seals, which was a nonprofit that provided disability services. And it was a very highly publicized campaign which tried to downplay the destructiveness of their product. So with frequent ties to corporate interests, the next fundamental issue with disability charities is unsurprising, which is the depoliticization of social welfare. So after all, many of these charities were being run by businesses and had links to people in big business, we see a huge conflict of interest when it comes to politics, or specifically the responsibility of the government to make sure that businesses are paying their workers adequately or providing really comprehensive healthcare and disability services. So many of these charities insisted that the best means of disabled aid comes in collective efforts in the private sector. So they emphasized that their work was not the government's obligation. They depoliticized social welfare and continuously framed it as a gift bestowed rather than something that is owed to disabled people in the name of their rights. So now we're going to be looking at a case study, which using the organization Autism Speaks. So it's not new to criticize Autism Speaks. They've been under scrutiny for a really long time. Autism advocates have pointed out that Autism Speaks focuses a lot on research and preventatives and identifying the causes of autism. And in response to scrutiny, they've added autistic members to their board 10 years after the founding, but that's really not enough to repair the kind of foundational issues with their mission and their work. So we see the historical disabled charity trend, the allegiance to corporate interests with Autism Speaks. In 2018, 1 out of 28 members of the board were autistic. However, 23 out of 28 members represented major corporations. For example, the chief marketing officer, Darren Good, has served in senior leadership and management positions at Apple, L'Oreal, Sony Pictures, Paramount Pictures, among many others. And the corporate supporters of Autism Speaks include the notable names of Chuck E. Cheese, Panera Bread, Home Depot, and White Castle, among many others. And in line with the similarity to the Easter Seals and the Snowmobile campaign, the vice chairman of Autism Speaks, who is also the vice president of White Castle System, worked with Autism Speaks board member to create the original slider White Castle hamburger scented candle, which raised awareness, according to them, and $350,000 for Autism Speaks. So leading into our next evaluation tool, where is the raised money going? A lot of it is not going to their programs that provide services to autistic adults and families. In 2018, only 1% of their budget went towards that, and 20% went towards more fundraising efforts, the expenses of which exceeded the spending of most programs. And additionally, in that year, many executive salaries went beyond $600,000 per year. So the goal really is not to make it an easier country to be an autistic person and with their work. When reviewing a lot of their language on their pages, which emphasize solutions in a kind of vague way, as shown by the picture on the right, which includes their mission statement, we see a person's face looking at the camera and the text that reads, enhancing lives today and a spectrum of solutions, accelerating a spectrum of solutions for tomorrow across the spectrum and throughout the lifespan. So much of their research tackles identifying autism at an earlier and earlier age, and especially even have to clarify on their page about research on genome sequencing that they are not, it's like in their frequently asked questions, they do not encourage eugenics or do not stand by eugenics, which is a really big issue if you have to clarify that on your page. And so a lot of what they're doing is kind of using this cure overcoming narrative, which we've seen before, that legitimize the public's bias against autistic people and autism itself, and not doing enough to support autistic families in campaigns around public policy or around grants themselves. So I think I will get to the last part, which is my recommendations. So for the future disabled charity, disability-focused charity, it's essential that there is, as the phrase goes in the community, nothing about us without us. The presence of disabled people on boards and staff can't just be for optics, and it can't just be a family member of someone who's disabled, because they have a really different perspective on disability, unless that disability involves being nonverbal, where it's the person that knows them best and can speak to their experiences. And charities must focus upon their responsibility towards social justice and not disability charity. So they must dismantle ableist biases, not reinforce them, and they must focus upon their responsibility, again, to put it succinctly, the best charity knows that it should not exist. Their work must involve advocacy, and they must recognize disability services as a right and not a luxury, which should centrally be provided by the government. So thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Kat. That was terrific. Okay, I'm going to I'll reclaim host. All right, so I'm now host. Okay, so we're going to move on to our third presenter this morning, and I'm hoping that I'm pronouncing your name right, Nipun Koshy.
Yep, that's correct.
Okay, fantastic. So the title of your presentation is Mind the Gaps, How New York City Students Learn About Light and Gravity. Do you need to have host capabilities as well?
Yes, I do.
Okay, give me 1 second.
No problem.
Yes, at the end. Okay, you are now host, so take it away.
Okay, can you see my screen? Cool, thank you. Hi, everyone. My topic is Mind the Gaps, How New York City Students Learn About Light. I decided to cut the gravity just because I realized my presentation was getting a bit too long. Hi, I'm Nipun Koshy. I'm a student at the Macaulay Honors College at the City College of New York, CUNY. I am a physics major and I'm interested in becoming an educator. And so I was interested in the topic of how students learn and what can be done to improve students' conceptions about light and gravity, considered to be some of the most difficult concepts in physics. This is my thesis. Much of the difficulty of physics stems not necessarily or not solely from the difficulty of the concepts themselves, but rather from the diversity and scope of physics and from the underdevelopment of unintuitive concepts combined with large intervals of time during which these concepts are barely, if at all, discussed. These may lead to the formation of gaps of knowledge. This is a really long thesis, and so to break it down, essentially I'm going to focus first on my methodology, and that'll lead on to the other types of ways people have tried to address the problems in education, and finally continue with gaps of knowledge and the research that I did. And so first of all, just to touch on my methodology, New York City teachers are given scope and sequences, which detail the information that they are required to teach students during each grade. For grades pre-K through 8, there's the scope and sequence on the left and 9 to 12 on the right. The first, most of the literature about education focuses a lot on the teaching and assessment practices used by teachers. This is actually what got me interested in focusing on curricula as opposed to these assessments. The two major types of teaching practices are teacher-centered and student-centered education. Teacher-centered education is again focused on the teacher. They're the provider of information, they often lecture, and it prioritizes memorization. Student-centered education focuses on the student. There's a great deal of hands-on activities, and that prioritizes critical thinking. As for the assessment practices, you'll notice that you can generally divide the assessment practices into two categories, and each category corresponds to a respective teaching practice. Standardized assessments, which are the assessments most commonly used in New York State in the regions, prioritize memorization because they're largely multiple choice. There are a few short response, but again, a lot of these short response questions reward students for knowing or memorizing certain details as opposed to thinking critically about a topic. Project-based assessments are far more open-ended and can be for response, such as labs or activities or group work, and this again prioritizes critical thinking. Students are given given an idea, and they're encouraged to explore this idea and present their work at the end. Generally, research has shown that student-centered education and project-based assessments, again, promotes critical thinking and leads students to have better critical thinking skills in the future, while teacher-centered education and standardized assessments are good for help students memorize a lot of information, but doesn't exactly help them develop their critical thinking. All this is what interested me a great deal. But what was more interesting for me was that a lot of this literature doesn't really discuss the context in which all this education is taking place. For example, in research done in Taiwan, for example, the researchers there noted that a lot of the ways students were measured by the country was using standardized assessments, and it's considered to be a meritocracy using these standardized assessments. And so even if students were taught using student-centered teaching practices and were given project-based assessments, they were graded on standardized assessments. And so students who were taught using teacher-centered practices often had an advantage as opposed to those who were taught using student-centered education. And so to learn more about the context was why I was looking at the curriculum. Gaps of knowledge is a term that I introduced. It's a separation between what one knows, which is learned from formal or informal education, and what one needs to know in order to fully understand and engage with an idea. And the best way I know to describe this is to ask a simple question. Has anyone here ever boiled a pot of water? You can raise your hand or the thumbs up in the, yeah. Wonderful, that makes it a lot easier. Okay, great. So how does water boil? And when did you learn about all these pieces of knowledge? And so here's a timeline that I made. And so for most students, when I ask them, most people can say when they were young, let's say pre-K or kindergarten, they know, okay, fire is hot. Water starts off cold, but then when the hot fire is put next to a pot of water, the hotness of the fire makes the water hot and it boils. In about fourth grade, for me personally, I learned a lot about the heat processes and convection. I learned that water starts off as a liquid, and as it gets hotter and hotter, it'll turn into a gas and start boiling. However, when I looked at the curricula that I mentioned before, convection is only formally discussed in earth science when you discuss magma and lava in the earth and about all the plate tectonics and everything. You'll note again the large gap between fourth grade and earth science. Finally, boiling is discussed more completely in chemistry class when you learn that boiling involves liquid particles in a liquid overcoming intermolecular forces. Now, you'll notice, as I mentioned before, the large gap between fourth grade and earth science. That's an incredibly great gap. That's a total of 6 years between the two mentions. And for some students, they might not even learn about convection currents. Although they do discuss convection currents in different grades, because it's only formally introduced in earth science, students may not fully understand that idea. And again, because it's discussed in the context of magma, students wouldn't quite connect the two concepts very easily. No one is boiling water and thinking, oh yes, this reminds me of magma and lava and plate tectonics. And so I take this as a great example of the difficulty of concepts in physics. You're drawing in, for the example of boiling, you're drawing in ideas from plate tectonics, from magma, when you're just talking about a pot of water you're boiling. And there are 6 year gaps between learning different ideas and concepts. And after 6 years, students might forget about certain ideas and nuances of certain topics. This is the graphical organizer I made similarly about light. And so the green colored grades are the grades in which light is discussed directly in a unit or addressed directly. The blue colored grades are the grades in which light could be discussed organically within the context of a different topic. Third grade, you'll note, isn't colored at all. There are no units in third grade in which light can be discussed organically. And that's okay, because again, throughout a student's education, a great deal of different topics in science are discussed. And so it would make sense if in 1 year, for example, light isn't discussed at all. That's just something to take note of in fourth grade. As for and underneath you'll notice for different types of boxes, and these all relate to different conceptions about light. An asterisk corresponds to the conception of light as a source of vision, a dagger as light as a source of energy or heat, a double dagger as light as a wave, and a silk row as light as a particle. And generally, you also notice that the gaps in between, the year gaps in between each box. And to start off with the first topic, first conception, we have light as a source of vision. This is introduced in pre-K and first grade. Essentially, it discusses how we can see things when light reflects off of these objects and enter our eyes. I feel that this concept is discussed and developed well. And the reason why is because something I used the word intuitive before in my thesis. When I use the word intuitive, I refer to things that can be experienced by our senses. So we can see things because light enters them. Seeing is a sense, and so light's role in vision is intuitive. If we go into a dark room, we can't see anything. We turn the light switch, we can see it. So there's obviously a relationship between light and vision. The second part of this conception, however, is the ray model of light. Although we use light rays colloquially, the ray model of light refers to light as straight lines that emanate from a source and reflect off of reflective surfaces. And obviously, we can't see light moving. Light moves far too fast for our eyes to catch. And so this is not intuitive at all. And it's first mentioned in 4th grade, and then developed in 8th grade, and then physics class in high school. And there are 4-year gaps in between each discussion, and that is definitely something to take note of. The second conception of light is light as a source of energy or heat. And you notice, as compared to the previous topic, it's mentioned a great deal, but in classes that are shaded blue, again referring to classes in which this isn't discussed directly. And the reason why is because it's often discussed in terms of plants and in discussions of weather and climate. Plants use sunlight to photosynthesize. That means that they need energy, and so light provides energy. It's also described in weather as a driving force of said weather. This is because, again, light is a source of energy, and when light hits water, water gets hot and it vaporizes. You'll notice again that though there aren't that many gaps in between each one, none of these concepts are really discussed in detail until high school physics. In high school physics is when students will learn about quantums, which are, again, a bit more modern physics, and discusses how to quantify this energy. Is this intuitive? Not really the quantum part, no, but light carrying energy is definitely intuitive. If you've been out on a hot summer day, you've definitely felt the sun beating on you. You've definitely felt that heat, and feeling heat is a sense. And so I would argue that this conception is intuitive. I don't have time to discuss the other two conceptions, light as a wave and light as a particle, but again, these are just some notes about both conceptions. Again, you'll notice some gaps in between different topics. For example, light as a wave. In between 4th and 8th grade, there is a 4-year gap. And it's discussed once in earth science, but again, other than that, there's a 4-year gap between 8th grade and high school physics. And conception 4 is only discussed in high school physics. This is modern physics though, so that's something that can be, that should be discussed at the end with tying everything else together. What are some solutions to these gaps of knowledge? With all these year gaps in between different discussions of topics and how some topics may be intuitive, some aren't. The best solution I thought of was simply just reviewing material at the start of at the start of a unit before learning new content. The issue with this, however, is twofold. First, this takes up time. Teachers are often complain that they don't have enough time to properly teach a topic, and spending perhaps one class or half a class just reviewing all the content from previous classes, especially at the high school level, would take a great deal of time, and teachers might not be able to accommodate that much time. The second thing is that this might not be a review for students who are new to New York City schools. For example, New York City has a great deal of immigrants. A lot of students from different school systems come to New York City to learn, and when they do, they may not have learned all the curricula that they used at their previous school system may have been very different from the one used in New York City, and so it might have been difficult for them to quote unquote review when in fact they didn't learn about any of this at all. That's all.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for a very thought-provoking talk from you. So that was terrific. Okay, I'm going to reclaim host. just so I can get it back over. All right, our last speaker before we start the discussion is Ricky LaSalle, and the title of the presentation is Finding the Dream, Politics, Presidents, and the Visions for the Future. So take it away. And I assume you need host capabilities as well.
Yeah.
All right, give me 1 second and I'll do that. All right, you should be good to go.
Okay. All right. Just a note, I have a 2 monitors set up, and when I put PowerPoint in full screen, it covers up both, so I won't be able to see you all, but I am going to come at it with good energy, so I hope everyone's still engaged. It's like a one-way mirror, so let's see if this will do it. Oh, Zoom does this nice little thing where you're on the side now. That's cool. All right, so here is my presentation. I changed the name a bit because I thought this kind of looked cool on the first slide, the Statue of Liberty having this thought bubble. So, what does America dream of? Politics, presidents, and visions for the future. And I am in Macaulay Honors College with the rest of who have been presenting today. So, without further ado, let's get to my thesis. So, it's a bit of a long one. But in general, what I'm talking about is the concept of the American dream, and more so how it's been used in a propagandistic way in sort of placating people and making them okay with the status quo when there's many changes that could greatly benefit people's lives. You know, one of those is sort of consumerism and the ideas of mass media being funded by advertisers. I get into a little bit of that. But before getting into that, I also should establish that this thesis is really a critique of capitalism. I think specifically American capitalism, just sort of like a disclaimer, because it'll get heavily into that. So here's the overview, sort of history, mythology, and capitalism, de facto, in fact, sort of common concepts that Americans agree that they want out of life in America versus how the facts line up, or sort of statistically the deal that people end up getting. Some presidential quotes taken, and then possible solutions to the issues I am highlighting with the status quo. So the American dream as a term was first coined by James Truslow Adams in his Epic of America. You can see this quote right here. The American dream is a dream of a land which life should be better and richer and fuller for everyone, with opportunity for each according to ability or achievement. And then sort of noting the end of this quote, sort of ability or achievement, we already see the hierarchical thinking that is, I think, so integral to sort of what is normal in American, either politically or socially. People are worthy of things if they are able to pursue them, or if they are high achievers or something of that sort of already distinguishing. Then second, we have, from Thomas Jefferson, that original sort of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness quote. This was his original draft because he drafted the Declaration of Independence. But essentially, when you really look at that part of unalienable rights and life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, that point specifically, that was very similar to what John Locke was saying, an Enlightenment philosopher, about also talking about life and liberty, but he added property as a right. So I think it's very important to note how property was taken out. Like, there's no way that the sort of founders of the United States didn't see those documents. They were heavily into sort of Enlightenment philosophy. So that was a very deliberate choice to swap out property for pursuit of happiness, as pursuit of happiness is a very vague concept. It's sort of anyone can what makes people happy differs, right, from people to people. So it's very elusive in that sense, and that's purposeful. And so the next slide. Okay, so some presidential quotes. So this first one is taken from W. Bush's inaugural speech, where he he won the election because of sort of Bush versus Gore Supreme Court case. I'll kind of touch on that a little later as well. But essentially, sort of the idea that we need to be personally responsible, right? But at the same time, we need to work together. So it's a bit oxymoronic, contradictory, but individualism is a huge part of sort of American thinking. I think American ideology, regardless of where you are, whether you're right leaning, left leaning, consider yourself more of a moderate, whichever you fall, I think we're always sort of inundated with the ideology to work for yourself, to sort of be a go-getter. Don't depend on others really. And yeah, that's a big part of sort of divide between people. I think is sort of you find the camps that you're in, and there's not a lot of collaboration. And then getting into Obama's quote, which was sort of on the onset of the Great Recession, we're talking about, and I'll get into these actually, the aspirations Americans hold are shared: a job that pays the bills, chance to get ahead, most of all, ability to give their children a better life. You know what else they share? Stubborn resilience in the face of adversity. So I pulled this out specifically because of the last part of sort of stubborn resilience in the face of adversity. Americans are often told to just like weather the storm, right? Whether it's a natural disaster that happens and sort of the cleanup that happens, or rather lack thereof, that we saw with like say Hurricane Katrina, or the differences between the Harvey cleanup versus Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico. When we look at how government sort of responds to crises, and sort of it's never proactive, it's always reactive. And because it's always reactive, a lot of people suffer because of that, and they're kind of told like, well, we always have hard times, so we're getting through it together, while at the same time sort of pushing the sort of individualist narrative as well, which is interesting. And so sort of those common aspects that Obama was talking about in that quote, sort of people talk about housing, right? Sort of the suburbanization that came after World War II, that was a big push, especially for more like affluent white Americans, returning veterans. There was redlining, of course, which sort of barred African Americans from being homeowners, and sort of created more, segregation in terms of who lives where and why they live there. But regardless, that still is a lot of people in America. Most people do live in a house, so that is still an important aspect. Retirement, being able to have enough money to enjoy your twilight years. Good education, right? People want good education for themselves, and if they're not able to be able to at least pass down that opportunity to their children. And freedom, right? We think of America as a very free nation, one of the stalwarts of democracy, and all of that sort of things. And then sort of the next slide, we talk into realities, right? Housing, maybe not as pushed by the government in recent years. I think especially because of the Great Recession and how many people were burned because of prime mortgage sort of loans getting out of hand. So it's still essential, right? We need some sort of dwelling to sort of live a stable life. But a lot of Americans pay so much of their income to it that it's such a burden. Retirement. So you have this little factoid, right? 64% of Americans aren't prepared for that. So most Americans live paycheck to paycheck. And I have a works cited slide at the end if you want to see where I'm getting some of these. So a lot of Americans live paycheck to paycheck. They can't afford, a $500 expense. And thus, retirement in a lot of states is very expensive. I think the cheapest is in Tennessee, I believe, and it's a little over $800,000. Not a lot of people have that. So we're sort of setting up a future of seniors who won't really be able to retire. They may have to work until death, which is very unfortunate. I think there really should be more care for the elderly in society. I don't think that's a value that is really set upon us by government. I don't think they really lead a good example of that in terms of care. And I think that extends to other categories because of the safety nets that have been gutted over increasing decades, and that leads me into sort of expensive education. Despite all of the money that is poured into education, more and more, like when you look at the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD, you sort of the 150 or so countries that are part of that pact, we're not near the top when it comes to performance, right? So despite all that money being put in, something's not giving. And a lot of people in this country, right, have student loan debt from college, which is an issue. And then freedom, the U.S. has been marked as a backsliding democracy in recent years, which isn't great. Freedom of the press, which is we've always thought of unwavering in this country, it's been challenged a lot in recent years. There's special interests have gotten increasingly more powerful. And these are some charts sort of showing you minimum wage. It really hasn't kept up to date with productivity. All of these various services from the 20-year gap from 1998 to 2018, getting more and more expensive for everyday Americans. So capitalism in the dream, I kind of touched upon it a bit, but everything that we do in America and the sort of why we care, and I would say is tied to capitalism. How you live, why you live where you live, how, if you're able to even go up, right, in social mobility or not, tied to capital access, whether that's property, how much your parents make, the people you know, if you join a fraternity in college, if you're even able to afford college, all of these things are tied to capitalism. And so we have a sort of quote from Noam Chomsky being, getting back into capitalism. A lot of the information we get is from media funded by advertisers whose sole purpose is to gain profit. So the mass media, right, they communicate messages, symbols to the populace, amuse, entertain, inform, inoculate values, beliefs, codes of behavior, integrate them into the structures of larger society. So all the hierarchies that we have, and then sort of who's at the top, the fact that there is, say, like a 1%, there is a middle class, but there is also a lower class, a threshold for poverty, keeping that hierarchy intact. The media's sort of job, because it's so heavily funded by advertisers, has been that, which seems a big, doom and gloom, but there's possible solutions. A lot of these may seem sort of radical with, the bipartisan squawking at one another, especially in our Congress. But these are some things that did help, tax the rich, the highest marginal tax rates are capped at like 37% now. But in the 50s, they were as high as 92%. Big business. There used to be a lot of trust busting, right? During Teddy Roosevelt's administration, there's too many monopolies right now. They have too much sort of consolidated power, which is not great for workers' rights, consumer rights in general. Healthcare, right? So many people go into medical debt in this country, which is unfortunate, right? I think having a healthy population that should be a priority of government. The Electoral College sort of stifles democracy a bit, because it's not who wins the most votes, it's who wins the, maybe even won over the threshold of electoral votes, which there is a compact, so there is a possible way could be ending. So states that would allocate all of their votes to the popular vote winner will make up 270 votes. If we stop having just a two-party system, I think more people would be engaged, because there's like 40% of voters who like just don't vote, like eligible, and they don't vote. So clearly they need more options, I think. Second Bill of Rights, that was proposed by FDR in 1944, sort of right to work, right to good education, right to enough money for food and shelter. Who knows if that will be applied, but I think that would go a long way with sort of getting people a better quality of life overall. And open up, what do you think? And yeah, we're excited, and I'm sure the various things, the crisis, and yeah, I'm finished. So thank you for hearing me out.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Ricky. I'm going to reclaim host. Okay, so we have about 15 minutes for questions. There's plenty of time for questions. The last paper were wonderful bookends for this particular session. They're talking about certain things that are really a part of our American culture, and then the two middle papers get at that sense in a different way, and even the scientific point of view gets at a sense of what you're all really kind of talking about. And that's this profound sense of community, and how a community fits in with everything that we're talking about. But I'm just a moderator, so I'm going to leave it up to you to ask questions. But I have a lot of questions, but I'd rather have you speak with each other. So let's open it up for questions. You may all unmute yourselves if you like.
Here we go.
And we have a question from a member of the audience, so I hope we can hear him.
Kind of no.
Yeah, why don't you move closer? We're going to have her move closer to the computer. So
Okay.
Hi, my name is Nancy Parrott. I'm an honors program director at Faculty at College. And I wanted to ask a question of Pat. The college that I work at supports at least 35% of students with learning differences. sort of disability charity narrative that you see at college campuses, perhaps your own or maybe a broader that you have? And what kind of work is being done to sort of really change the narrative?
That's a great question. That's a great question. I think that essentially, it's something that I was reading it in actually it was a transcript from a podcast by these I think it was from the Disability Visibility Project. And it was two people that are very prominent members of a lot of the disability justice community. And they were talking about how being part of what's called specifically, I know it's kind of alarming when you say it, but called the CRIP community, which is kind of a self-named, like kind of taking a lot of pride in the label of being disabled community is what saved them. Like being a part of that community and knowing, having that connection, which I think historically, because a lot of disabled people from a lack of public access have been relegated to isolation, I think has really impacted someone's sense of identity because they don't have this exposure to a community. So I think that among college campuses or among a lot of popular culture, I think that if it's not portraying disability negatively, it's just being too too positive about it or trying to rescue someone from their disability. And that's one of the issues when people have this kind of division between identity first or person first language, like a person with a disability versus a disabled person. A lot of the disabled community finds issue with the person with a disability label because they think it takes that aspect, it's trying to rob someone of their identity. So I think that among campuses, there should be an emphasis on disability neutrality, disability being just a neutral aspect of someone's identity, in addition to a positive part. But then also, I think one of the most essential parts is to build awareness of disability justice rather than kind of just a passing understanding of like, okay, this person has a disability, we're not really going to talk about it. You know what I mean? I think just building community is like a really important part of the future of disabled services and disabled care on college campuses. I hope that answers the question.
Okay, other questions or comments or anything you want to open up? Go ahead, Troy. Are you gonna
Oh, wait, Troy, are you gonna ask?
Come again?
Are you gonna ask a question?
Oh, sure, of course. I got a question. Wait, does that have to be directed to you? I'm sorry.
It doesn't have to be for me. I was just asking in general.
Oh, sure. For another call for Kat. What are the ways you would call for disability justice rather than disability charity? Because I remember that.
I think a lot of it comes from, just like kind of calling for structural changes in the government. For example, like a really interesting example specifically with Autism Speaks is that one of the donors that they profiled was talking about how he has a son that has autism. His son is like 40 years old. He lives in a separate apartment from him. And his son has 3 different caregivers that live with him that allow him to have this separate life from his family and have this type of independence. And I think, for example, with Autism Speaks is that they used this man's donation when he was talking about this for further research on like type of cure things or like doing research on like identifying earlier. But what I was thinking about is like, it's really essential that they use kind of the money to make it such that the government knows that it's their responsibility to provide that type of independence giving care to any disabled person. It's their right. It's not something that should be a lucky thing that some people acquire that is gifted to a small part of the population. I think it's emphasizing, and maybe it's because I'm a human rights student, but it's emphasizing a responsibility of the government to ensure that disabled people have every aspect of the services that they're owed in the UDHR, if we're going to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, if that's what we're going by.
Thank you.
I have a question for Nipun. So I know you want to be an educator. So do you have any specific, number one, like did you feel like your project had any impact on how you're thinking about educating in the future? Like what are you specifically taking away very largely from that may have surprised you in the course of your research?
So again, the whole idea of reviewing concepts was something that was always taught to me. I know that when I discuss any new concepts, my teachers always spent some time reviewing connected concepts, but definitely like the emphasis of doing that and realizing that again, some students just may have forgotten. It may have been too long for them, and also the fact that realizing again, as I mentioned at the end, that different students have different curricula, and not to assume that any student knows something. I know, for example, at my college, a friend of mine was saying that when he was asked a question about kinetic energy to his professor said, "Oh, when you studied kinetic energy in fourth grade," and when the student didn't, he felt uncomfortable to bring that up again because the professor assumed that he knew something when he didn't. And so just realizing and being accepting of the fact that some students may or may not know something, may have forgotten, may have never learned it, and then realizing that and spending that extra, even if it takes a whole day of class, just spending that extra time just so that everyone starts off on the same base level to build off of.
Yeah, that makes me think, what about towards the end of your slide, Nipun, teachers may say like it'll take up too much time. Perhaps they could have like say like a review week, like start the students an extra week early, go over, each class like main subject, maybe like a day, just sort of like workshops, working together with like based projects. Don't even like grade it, but just have it be for the sake of learning and reviewing those concepts. Has anything like that been talked about by like the DOE or any other sort of
I don't
educational?
think there's been a formal DOE wide, Department of Education wide, I like proposal for that. I feel that I know that for instance, my brother goes to a high school in which they do have like fighters are reserved for like review or for discussions. And so I know that at the school level, some schools choose to have review sessions or extra sessions to discuss and review things that the students learn. But again, that's more of a school choice as opposed to a wide department choice.
I have a question for Ricky and Troy, actually, that goes together, and it really has to do with housing and capitalism, specifically American capitalism. It seems to me that New York City is a great example of all that has gone wrong with American capitalism. We've seen now the uprising of these idiots, and I can think of no other way to describe it. These very thin, tall towers that are residential buildings that they can't fill, by the way. So I wonder if you two would talk a little bit about the home, how does that fit in with the homeless issue and this idea of capitalism? Because it seems to me that New York City for a very long time has not been very, it doesn't lend itself for normal people, for lack of a better phrase, to live. That it is a city of billionaires, really, even now more than millionaires. And the people that are doing the day-to-day business have to go out even further than, say, Long Island City, which is no longer livable because it's too expensive, or God forbid Brooklyn, which has been gentrification, all of that. Does my question make sense?
Definitely. I too hate the thin skyscrapers. I even in the past made a whole argument on why 425 Madison, the one that's all squares and half of it is empty, is just a terrible building and a waste of space. But speaking more on homelessness with those areas, most of those buildings end up being built in either Midtown or the financial district, and within that area, it's already pretty. Speaking with homelessness, it's already non-hospitable with there being I really didn't touch on this in my presentation, but a big recently Eric Adams has just signed in not law, but he wants to end the prevalence of homeless encampments around the city, and he's are really just taking homelessness away from areas that people can see it walking, so they don't really think about it anymore. And with that, it's just throughout the city of COVID, due to shelters not being good and not wanting to go to where the city provides them due to safety. Uh, Homeless individuals have come together and made like encampments, way to think about it would be like Hoovervilles, but like not as connected or less a sense of community. And as I said, that doesn't look very cleanly. It doesn't look very marketable for the city. So they're just going in and destroying these encampments, throwing everything into the dumpster, and saying, "Well, you can go to the shelters." So really, it's just I guess my end is that the city's more just continuing to push homelessness out of its view in hopes that the billions it receives from outside investors and outside businesses can just kind of sway that.
Yeah, and adding on to Troy, touching upon sort of homelessness and capitalism in New York City, like yeah, they're definitely I heard about like the Adams move to push the encampments. I actually was watching New York One the other day, and they were interviewing some people being removed from an encampment. And one of the guys, he was just saying like, listen, we don't do any harm here. We just like we're trying to live, and they're just like pushing us out basically. I mean, they're forcing them into shelters. They're like, you can't be here because it's dangerous for you. But they've already been living there, and it's like there's clearly a disconnect between the solutions offered and like how much they actually help, and the city will never acknowledge it. I think there's just a large anti-homeless bias. It's sort of like, you know, and it's expressed in public sentiment too, of sort of like we don't want to see homeless people on the train. We don't want to, like what Troy was talking about, like just removing it from consciousness so we forget about it. And I think that ties into sort of my project, like the media's job, right? It's like look, this isn't actually, when you need more ratings, oh, this is a huge problem because they're beating people up and this and that. But they're not talking about, say, all the people who are on the brink of homelessness. Why are they on the brink? Was there just sort of like an eviction moratorium? Why weren't, these landlords who make so much money? And I'm not talking about someone who's like, they own like, okay, a couple of units, and yeah, they're definitely way better off than the average New Yorker, but there's a difference between that and like a mega corporation that owns like city blocks. So like those people that own city blocks, that owns like so many areas where people live, and they're really, they're doing a generous job of not accepting back rent or not being able to evict people. Housing is such an essential part of allowing people to pursue what they want to pursue, because moving on from surviving the stability, and people aren't given stability a lot of the time. Sort of the rent, right? Paying so much of your rent. There's all these jokes. It's like, oh, you move in with 15 roommates after you graduate college, and it's like that's really not funny when you think about it, because a lot of people do have to struggle like that and split up the rent. Maybe not with 15, but with multiple people. Um, and it's sort of seen as just like, oh, this is like a growing pains. Like maybe people shouldn't have to go through those growing pains. Maybe the government should actually make sure people have some sort of stability in their lives and be secure. Like yeah, like again, those ugly, stupid skyscrapers. Not just 425 Madison. Most of those are half empty. And it's like about all these units that are owned by the super rich, and they come to New York once or twice a year just to dawdle around and look at the peasants from their high views, and it's like they're not really paying that much for these vacant units. I mean, there should be a much larger tax if it's going to go unused for so long, where people could be living there and could do something. Also, affordable housing is a joke. All these times they build things, it's like based on area median income. My dad actually was able to win a few lotteries, and he's like, "Oh, it's too expensive. We can't move from where we are, because where we are is the rent is controlled. It raises by a certain amount, but it's because it's like this weird area where it's like a union co-op, which is that's not a common thing in the city, right? Unions are gutted for anything that isn't like the sort of construction agencies, because he's part of IBU, so International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers, Local 3. You're able to live here and have our rent be controlled, and all those union benefits. Most people don't have that. That's another thing. I didn't touch upon it in my presentation, but I think if we really bring back a push for unionization, we hear these big corporations, they hate it. They're like, oh no, we can't have people unionize. Can't talk about unionization at Walmart, right? The nation's biggest private employer. Probably Amazon's gonna supersede them. But they also hate, unionization. And why do they hate it? Because they know that when people get together and then they can see the ways that the sort of system has shafted them, and it made things unfair when it shouldn't be, that's where the real change gets to be, and where it starts to not even hurt their pocketbooks. It's just a really issue of greed going unchecked. And I think New York City is definitely showcase of too much greed going unchecked, and the rich being placated while everyone else has to fight for the scraps.
It's a shame because it really is such a great city, but I'm happy that both of you mentioned Adams because that signifies that it's not just a Democrat or a Republican issue, but it's something a little bit more. Giuliani did the same thing with the homeless and tried to, brush them under the carpet, and so there's a lot of that. We are really out of time, but I really want to thank you for this fantastic panel. A lot of really interesting topics were brought up. You're doing fantastic work, so thank you very much, and another round of applause. All right, see you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a great day. Enjoy the rest of your weekend.